The plantation stood far from public roads, separated from towns and courts by marshland, slow rivers, and deliberate distance. Its isolation was not accidental. It allowed the estate to function as a closed system, governed by internal rules rather than external oversight. The main house rose slightly above the surrounding fields, not grand by city standards but imposing within its environment, positioned to observe and dominate the land it controlled. The structure itself was the center of authority, not only because the owner resided there, but because proximity to it defined status, punishment, and survival. Those assigned to work inside the house lived under a different form of pressure than those in the fields. They were spared the worst physical labor, but they were never beyond scrutiny. The walls remembered everything. The floors carried weight and sound. Nothing inside the house was neutral, and nothing inside it belonged to those who maintained it. The daily order of the estate followed rigid patterns enforced by both written ledgers and unspoken rules. The bell that marked the beginning of labor was not loud, but it was absolute. Within minutes of its sound, bodies had to be present and accounted for. House servants moved first, preparing rooms, arranging meals, and restoring the appearance of calm before the owner emerged. Their work was expected to be invisible. Any trace of effort suggested disorder. Cleanliness was not comfort. It was control. Every object had a place, and any deviation from expectation was treated as intent rather than error. Oversight came not only from the owner but from the hierarchy beneath him. The overseer, the senior house staff, and the systems of reporting that ensured no action went unnoticed. The house was not a refuge from the plantation's brutality. It was its nerve center. The main character had been assigned to the house several years earlier, transferred from outdoor labor without ceremony or explanation. The reassignment was not a promotion, nor was it a mercy. It was a calculated placement. Those chosen for indoor work were expected to possess restraint, attentiveness, and the ability to remain silent under pressure. The servants' days were structured around repetitive tasks that required precision rather than strength. Cleaning floors, maintaining furniture, tending to private rooms, and anticipating needs before they were expressed. Through these routines, habits formed that revealed character without words. The servant moved carefully, avoided unnecessary noise, and memorized the rhythms of the house, learning when rooms were empty, when doors were locked, and when presence became risk. There was no room for curiosity. Observation was unavoidable, but acknowledgement was dangerous. The master's bedroom occupied the most protected space in the house. Access was limited, and duties there were assigned selectively. The room symbolized authority more than comfort, and its maintenance carried additional scrutiny. The servant learned to work there with particular caution, minimizing time spent and ensuring nothing appeared disturbed. The floorboards were thick, the furniture heavy, and the atmosphere controlled. No personal artifacts were left unattended, and no questions were tolerated. The servant understood that this room represented the center of the plantation's private life, a space where actions taken would never be explained to those outside it. The boundaries were clear, and crossing them carried consequences that were neither debated nor appealed. The social structure among the house servants mirrored the broader system of the plantation but operated with greater subtlety. Senior servants enforced discipline, not out of loyalty but survival. They corrected mistakes quickly, discouraged attention, and passed warnings through indirect gestures rather than speech. Informants existed, though their identities shifted. Some were known, others suspected. Trust was a liability. The overseer appeared frequently in the house, not to perform tasks but to observe behavior. His presence served as reminder that proximity to power did not grant protection. It only increased the cost of error. The servant had learned to maintain composure in these conditions, absorbing stress without visible reaction and storing observations without immediate use. Occasionally, memory intruded in fragments rather than narratives. The servant recalled the transition from the fields to the house as a moment marked by silence rather than relief. The change brought different expectations and different risks. Physical exhaustion had been replaced by constant vigilance. Mistakes were no longer measured in output but in perception. The servant remembered witnessing another house worker removed without explanation after being suspected of speaking out of turn. No punishment had been seen, but absence itself functioned as warning. From that moment, the servant understood that survival depended on controlling what was acknowledged, not what was known. The plantation owner maintained a public reputation of order and propriety. Visitors saw a disciplined operation, well-managed labor, and a household that reflected control rather than indulgence. Inside the house, however, moods shifted unpredictably. The owner's attention could linger without reason, and his instructions often carried implications beyond their immediate content. Servants learned to interpret tone and timing rather than words. The owner's spouse or relative, when present, remained distant, neither intervening nor questioning. Their silence reinforced the hierarchy rather than softening it. Power did not need to announce itself. It operated through expectation. The first deviation from routine occurred without drama. It began during an ordinary cleaning assignment in the master's bedroom, a task the servant had performed countless times. While attending to the floor near the bed, the servant noticed a slight inconsistency beneath the surface. One board did not respond as expected to pressure. The difference was minimal, easily dismissed as age or wear, but it disrupted the servant's internal map of the room. The house was old, but its maintenance was strict. Irregularities were corrected immediately. The servant paused, assessing risk, and chose not to apply force. The board was cleaned, aligned, and left undisturbed. Over the following days, small details accumulated. The servant became aware of sounds that did not align with known routines, low and infrequent, originating beneath the bedroom during hours when access was restricted. These were not constant, nor were they easily defined. The servant did not attempt to interpret them, only to note their occurrence. Attention to such patterns had become a survival mechanism. At the same time, the owner's behavior shifted subtly. He became more attentive to the bedroom, checking its condition more frequently and issuing instructions that limited access further. The senior house staff reinforced these restrictions without explanation. The servant experienced a growing sense of unease not because of a single alarming discovery but because of the convergence of small, unacknowledged signals. The plantation functioned on predictability. Deviations suggested intent. The servant understood that whatever lay beneath the surface of the room was not meant to be known by those assigned to maintain it. The question was not what existed there, but what the knowledge of it would cost. The servant continued to perform duties as instructed, maintaining composure and avoiding any visible hesitation. Outward behavior remained unchanged, but internal awareness sharpened. Interactions with other servants began to reflect the shift. Tasks were reassigned without explanation. Rotations increased. Individuals who had worked the bedroom were moved to other areas of the house. No justification was offered. These changes suggested containment rather than correction. The servant recognized the pattern. Limit exposure, control information, prevent familiarity. It was a strategy used when something could not be removed but needed to be hidden. The overseer's presence inside the house increased, his inspections more frequent, his attention less predictable. Servants avoided lingering in shared spaces, minimizing opportunities for unsanctioned observation. The servant's role brought unavoidable proximity to the source of concern. Unlike others, the servant remained assigned to the bedroom intermittently, a fact that carried both risk and implication. It suggested either trust or oversight. Neither interpretation offered safety. The servant became more deliberate in movement, ensuring no trace of hesitation could be read as suspicion. Every action was calculated to appear routine. The servant avoided looking beneath furniture unnecessarily, avoided pausing near the floorboards, and avoided being alone in the room longer than required. These precautions did not erase awareness. They only postponed confrontation with it. One evening, while completing a routine task elsewhere in the house, the servant overheard indirect references to restricted areas and unspoken consequences. The information was not explicit, but it confirmed that others sensed irregularities without naming them. Fear circulated without focus. The servant understood that knowledge was spreading without clarity, creating conditions in which mistakes would be punished regardless of intent. In such environments, being uninformed could be as dangerous as knowing too much. The servant began to weigh the cost of continued silence against the risk of accidental discovery. The first true spark of conflict occurred when the servant was instructed to perform maintenance in the bedroom during an unscheduled interval. The timing was unusual. The owner was absent, and oversight was limited. The task required moving furniture slightly, an action that brought the servant closer to the area of concern. While repositioning a heavy piece near the bed, the servant felt the same inconsistency beneath the floor, more pronounced than before. The board shifted subtly under weight, confirming that it was not merely worn. The servant froze, aware that this was no longer an abstract suspicion but a physical reality. The servant did not investigate further. No attempt was made to lift the board or examine what lay beneath. Instead, the furniture was returned to its original position, and the task was completed with visible care. The servant's heart rate increased, but posture remained controlled. This restraint was not rooted in obedience alone, but in an understanding of consequence. Any further action would transform awareness into evidence. The servant left the room as instructed, ensuring no signs of disturbance remained. That night, the servant could not dismiss the confirmation. The knowledge of a concealed space beneath the master's bedroom introduced a new dimension to the servant's understanding of the plantation. The house was no longer simply a site of authority. It was a structure designed to contain secrets. The servant recognized that whatever existed beneath the room was integrated into the system of control rather than incidental to it. The servant did not yet know its purpose, only that it was intentionally hidden and actively protected. The following day, additional restrictions were imposed. Access to the bedroom was reduced further. The servant was reassigned temporarily, a decision framed as routine but felt as response. The message was clear: containment had begun. The servant realized that the window for ignorance was closing. Even without direct action, the servant's proximity had created risk. The system did not require proof to punish. Suspicion alone was sufficient. By the end of the day, the servant understood that the plantation's stability depended on more than labor and obedience. It depended on the suppression of certain truths. The concealed space beneath the master's bedroom represented a boundary that, once perceived, altered everything. The servant had not yet crossed it, but awareness alone had placed them in danger. The story had not escalated into open conflict, but the first irreversible condition had been established. The servant now knew that something existed which was never meant to be acknowledged, and the cost of that knowledge had yet to be determined. The changes that followed the servant's quiet confirmation of the hidden space were not announced as responses to any specific act. They arrived as procedural adjustments, framed as efficiency or discipline, but their purpose was unmistakable. The house began to operate under tighter internal control. Tasks that had once been routine were redistributed without explanation. Access lists were revised. Servants who had worked certain rooms for years were reassigned to peripheral duties. These measures were subtle enough to appear administrative, yet precise enough to indicate that someone was actively narrowing the circle of exposure. The plantation had entered a defensive posture, not against rebellion or escape, but against awareness. Within the house, surveillance intensified in ways that did not require constant presence. The overseer no longer needed to stand in rooms to exert pressure. His influence was conveyed through altered schedules, unexpected inspections, and the removal of predictability. Servants were made uncertain of when they would be observed, which tasks might be scrutinized, and which minor deviation could be interpreted as intent. The system relied on anticipation rather than punishment alone. The servant felt this pressure immediately. Even after reassignment away from the master's bedroom, the servant understood that distance did not equal safety. It merely delayed evaluation. The servant adapted by reducing visibility. Movements became more economical, interactions fewer, posture neutral. Every action was filtered through an internal calculation of risk. This restraint was not new, but it deepened under the weight of recent knowledge. The servant understood that the system did not distinguish between accidental discovery and deliberate investigation. The presence of concealed space beneath the master's bedroom meant that certain truths existed outside acceptable knowledge. Anyone who came close to them was subject to scrutiny, regardless of intent. The servant's challenge was no longer whether to seek the truth, but whether to survive proximity to it. Other servants sensed the shift as well. The house grew quieter, not from obedience but from caution. Informal cooperation declined. Small acts of mutual assistance were replaced by avoidance. The senior house staff enforced new rules with particular severity, emphasizing compliance while offering no explanations. Their behavior suggested fear rather than loyalty. They were maintaining order not to protect the household, but to shield themselves from implication. In such an environment, silence became both a defense and a liability. Rumors began to circulate without structure. They were incomplete, contradictory, and intentionally vague. Some referenced restricted spaces, others hinted at practices beyond normal discipline. None named specifics. The servant recognized the pattern of fear without understanding. This was not the spread of rebellion, but of unease. Knowledge was fragmenting rather than consolidating. That fragmentation served the system. It prevented collective understanding while amplifying individual anxiety. Each person feared being the one who knew too much. The plantation owner's behavior reinforced this tension. His presence in the house increased, not as a visible threat but as an assertion of control. He inspected rooms personally, asked indirect questions, and altered routines with little notice. His attention lingered on servants assigned to sensitive areas, evaluating not their performance but their composure. The servant observed these interactions from a distance, noting how easily suspicion could be manufactured. The owner did not require evidence to justify intervention. Authority alone was sufficient. The servant's motivations revealed themselves through restraint rather than action. Despite the opportunity to seek further confirmation of the concealed space, the servant avoided it. This avoidance was not rooted in denial but in strategy. The servant understood that any deliberate investigation would escalate risk beyond management. Instead, the servant focused on observing patterns that could be explained as routine awareness. When access schedules changed, the servant noted who gained or lost proximity. When certain objects were moved or removed, the servant recorded their absence mentally. This form of observation allowed the servant to remain informed without crossing explicit boundaries. At the same time, the servant made small choices that carried moral weight. When another servant faced scrutiny for a minor infraction, the servant adjusted their own tasks to absorb additional labor, reducing attention on the other. This act was not altruistic alone. It was calculated. The servant understood that punishment created pressure for betrayal. By minimizing conflict around vulnerable individuals, the servant attempted to preserve silence. However, these choices increased the servant's own workload and visibility. The system rewarded compliance but punished initiative, even when it appeared supportive. As pressure increased, fractures among the servants became more visible. Some responded by aligning more closely with authority, volunteering information, or emphasizing obedience. Others withdrew entirely, minimizing interaction and reducing exposure. A few attempted to warn others indirectly, using gestures or omissions rather than explicit communication. The servant recognized these behaviors as survival strategies rather than moral positions. In an environment where knowledge itself was dangerous, intention mattered less than perception. The overseer's role shifted from enforcement to prevention. His inspections focused less on outcomes and more on behavior. He evaluated how servants moved through space, how long they lingered, and how they reacted to unexpected interruptions. The servant experienced several such interruptions, moments where routine tasks were halted without explanation. Each time, the servant responded with controlled compliance, offering no indication of stress. Internally, these moments reinforced the reality that the servant was being assessed not for guilt, but for awareness. The conflict became impossible to ignore when the servant encountered physical evidence of containment. During a routine task unrelated to the master's bedroom, the servant discovered materials that suggested recent construction or reinforcement. These items were stored discreetly, their placement inconsistent with normal maintenance practices. The servant understood that this was not coincidental. The plantation was not only hiding something, it was actively modifying its structure to protect it. This realization elevated the stakes. The concealed space was not a relic of the past. It was an ongoing concern. Faced with this evidence, the servant confronted a difficult moral and survival choice. Continued silence offered temporary protection but increased the likelihood of accidental implication. Intentional ignorance was no longer possible. At the same time, deliberate exposure carried consequences that extended beyond the individual. Any attempt to reveal the concealed space would destabilize the household and likely result in collective punishment. The servant understood that the system responded to threats by amplifying suffering rather than addressing truth. The servant considered limited disclosure, the possibility of confiding in one trusted individual. This option carried its own risks. Trust was unstable, and fear could transform confidence into informants. The servant evaluated past behavior, noting who had resisted pressure and who had adapted too quickly. No option offered certainty. The servant's internal conflict was not between courage and fear, but between competing forms of danger. Silence preserved the system. Exposure endangered everyone within it. Ultimately, the servant chose a middle path, partial awareness without articulation. The servant began to prepare for the possibility of forced disclosure by strengthening internal memory rather than external proof. The layout of the house, the timing of movements, and the sequence of changes were committed to memory. This knowledge was not intended for immediate use but served as contingency. If the servant were confronted directly, the ability to respond with coherence rather than confusion could determine outcome. Preparation replaced investigation. As days passed, the consequences of the initial discovery continued to unfold. One servant was abruptly removed from house duty and reassigned to the fields without explanation. Another disappeared entirely from the household, their absence acknowledged only through redistributed tasks. These outcomes reinforced the cost of proximity to sensitive areas. The servant recognized that the system was willing to sacrifice individuals to preserve secrecy. This recognition stripped away any remaining illusion of proportionality. Punishment was not corrective. It was preventative. The plantation's outward operations continued unchanged. Crops were tended, schedules maintained, visitors received. To an external observer, nothing appeared amiss. Internally, however, the house functioned under constant tension. Servants adjusted their behavior to avoid attention, even when that attention was arbitrary. The servant felt this tension as a continuous strain, a demand to maintain composure despite uncertainty. Sleep became fragmented. Awareness persisted even during rest. The servant's role placed them in a position where avoidance alone could no longer guarantee safety. The system's tightening controls suggested that containment was incomplete. Someone knew enough to justify reinforcement, but not enough to resolve the threat. In such conditions, suspicion spreads until it finds an outlet. The servant understood that eventually, a decisive moment would arrive, forcing action or exposure. The choice was no longer whether to act, but when and how. By the end of this phase, the conflict had shifted from isolated discovery to systemic response. The servant had not yet escalated the situation deliberately, but the consequences of awareness were already manifesting. The plantation's stability was being defended through increased control, and that defense was generating new forms of harm. The servant stood at the center of this process, not as an instigator, but as a point of convergence between knowledge and power. The story had not reached its climax, but the conditions for irreversible escalation were now firmly in place. The consequences of the earlier containment measures did not stabilize the household as intended. Instead, they intensified the internal pressure, transforming suspicion into a constant operational principle. What had begun as selective restriction evolved into a broader pattern of control that affected every layer of the plantation's domestic structure. The system no longer assumed ignorance among servants. It actively tested for it. Schedules were altered repeatedly, sometimes within the same day, disrupting established routines and increasing the likelihood of mistakes. Oversight became less predictable and more invasive. The house ceased to function as a place of ordered labor and instead became a mechanism for psychological sorting, identifying who could maintain composure under sustained uncertainty. The servant felt this shift immediately. Tasks were assigned and revoked without explanation, forcing constant adjustment. The servant's earlier strategy of minimizing visibility became harder to maintain as unpredictability increased. Avoidance now risked appearing evasive. Compliance, when too precise, risked suggesting foreknowledge. The servant was forced to navigate a narrowing corridor of acceptable behavior, where neutrality itself became suspect. Each movement through the house carried layered meaning, interpreted not only for its outcome but for what it might imply about internal awareness. Authority responded to the growing instability by asserting itself more aggressively. The overseer's presence inside the house became routine rather than exceptional. His inspections no longer focused on cleanliness or efficiency but on patterns of movement and access. He monitored who crossed certain thresholds, how long they remained in particular rooms, and whether their assignments overlapped in ways that could allow shared observation. This level of scrutiny communicated a clear message. The house was no longer assumed secure. It was under investigation. At the same time, the plantation owner intensified his control through indirect measures. He limited the number of servants permitted near private areas, reduced redundancy in assignments, and introduced new procedures that required constant verification. These changes were framed as administrative improvements, but their effect was isolating. Servants were prevented from forming consistent working pairs or routines that might allow shared understanding. The system was being deliberately fragmented to prevent collective awareness. Knowledge, if it existed, was to remain individual, incomplete, and dangerous. Under this pressure, secondary characters revealed their positions through action rather than declaration. Some servants adapted quickly, aligning themselves more closely with authority. They volunteered for tasks others avoided, accepted oversight without resistance, and adjusted their behavior to signal transparency. Their compliance was not rewarded with protection, but it reduced immediate scrutiny. Others withdrew further, limiting their presence and interaction, attempting to disappear into the background. A few demonstrated subtle resistance, not by challenging authority but by refusing to provide information beyond what was required, even when pressured. These behaviors created a shifting internal landscape of loyalty, fear, and quiet defiance. The servant observed these changes with growing clarity. Earlier restraint had preserved safety, but the environment now demanded adaptation. The servant recognized that passive silence was no longer sufficient. The system's escalation suggested that someone within the house had come close enough to the concealed space to justify aggressive containment. Whether that person was the servant or another did not matter. The response was collective. In such conditions, survival depended on anticipating the system's next move rather than reacting to it. The decisive escalation occurred when the servant was unexpectedly reassigned to the master's bedroom under heightened supervision. The reassignment was framed as temporary and procedural, but its timing was deliberate. The servant understood that this was a test. The system was reintroducing proximity to observe response. The presence of the overseer nearby during the task reinforced this interpretation. The servant's earlier avoidance strategies were now impossible. The servant would either perform the task under scrutiny or refuse it and invite suspicion. Inside the bedroom, the servant immediately noted changes. Furniture had been repositioned slightly, not for comfort but to obscure access to specific areas of the floor. The reinforced section beneath the bed was more pronounced than before, its alignment subtly altered. The servant recognized signs of recent modification. Differences in texture, faint marks where tools had been applied, and a general sense that the space had been deliberately sealed rather than merely concealed. This confirmed that the hidden area was not a static feature but an active concern. Someone had been there recently, and the plantation was responding to that fact. The servant's awareness sharpened into certainty. The concealed space beneath the master's bedroom was integral to the owner's authority, not incidental. It functioned as an extension of control, separate from the visible systems of punishment and discipline. The servant did not yet know the full scope of its purpose, but the evidence pointed toward practices that required secrecy not because they were illegal in the abstract, but because they threatened the plantation's carefully maintained appearance of order. This realization shifted the moral weight of the situation. Silence was no longer merely self-preservation. It was participation in concealment. The servant made a decisive choice during this assignment, one that could not be undone. While performing routine maintenance under observation, the servant deliberately memorized the precise layout of the reinforced area. The measurements, the placement relative to fixed points in the room, the nature of the modifications, and the sequence in which access would be possible were all committed to memory. This was not an act of curiosity but of preparation. The servant understood that if confrontation became unavoidable, coherence and specificity would determine credibility. Vague suspicion could be dismissed. Structured knowledge could not. This choice marked a transition from passive endurance to active readiness. The servant had crossed an internal threshold. Even without physical entry into the concealed space, the servant now possessed organized knowledge that could challenge the system's narrative. That knowledge could not be erased without erasing the servant. From this point forward, the servant's survival and the secret's survival were linked. The system responded swiftly. Following the assignment, the servant experienced intensified scrutiny. Tasks were interrupted, movements questioned indirectly, and access further restricted. The overseer's attention lingered longer, evaluating posture and reaction rather than work quality. The servant recognized these behaviors as confirmation that the test had not gone unnoticed. Whether the system suspected the servant of knowing too much or merely sought reassurance no longer mattered. The servant was now a variable to be managed. Visible harm followed soon after, directed not at the servant but at someone adjacent. Another house servant, one who had previously worked near the bedroom, was singled out for punishment following a minor procedural error. The severity of the response far exceeded the infraction, serving as a warning rather than correction. The servant understood the message immediately. The system was willing to inflict harm to reinforce silence, regardless of guilt. This act removed any remaining illusion that restraint alone could prevent collateral damage. The moral question at the center of the story emerged with full force at this point. The servant faced a conflict between survival and responsibility, not in abstract terms but through observable consequences. Silence protected the servant temporarily but exposed others to arbitrary punishment. Exposure carried the potential to disrupt the system but would likely result in severe retaliation. There was no path that avoided harm. The servant's earlier neutrality had become untenable. Fear within the house reached a new level. Servants avoided eye contact, limited movement, and accepted reassignment without protest. Informal communication collapsed entirely. The plantation functioned outwardly, but internally it operated under siege conditions. The servant perceived that the system was nearing a breaking point. Secrecy required continuous reinforcement, and reinforcement was generating instability. The concealed space beneath the bedroom had become a focal point of fear, even among those who did not know its specifics. The servant's next action solidified the approach to climax. Recognizing that knowledge confined to memory could be lost through removal or death, the servant made a calculated effort to ensure continuity. Without creating physical evidence, the servant structured the information mentally in a way that could be transmitted quickly and coherently if necessary. The sequence of discovery, the nature of the modifications, and the pattern of authority responses were all organized into a narrative framework. This was not preparation for rebellion, but for testimony. The servant was preparing to speak if forced, not because it guaranteed justice, but because silence no longer guaranteed survival. Authority figures sensed the shift. The overseer's behavior became more confrontational, though still indirect. He positioned himself as intermediary, increasing pressure without formal accusation. The plantation owner remained outwardly composed but intensified his control over private spaces. His movements suggested urgency rather than confidence. The servant observed these behaviors as confirmation that the system's stability was compromised. The secret required constant maintenance, and that maintenance was failing. Loss followed quickly. One of the few servants who had resisted pressure through silence was removed from the house entirely. Their reassignment or disappearance was not explained, but its timing was clear. The servant interpreted this as escalation. The system was no longer managing risk, it was eliminating it. This development clarified the stakes. The servant's own position was no longer marginal. It was central. By the end of this phase, the plantation stood on the edge of open confrontation. The concealed space beneath the master's bedroom had transformed from a hidden feature into a destabilizing force. The servant's actions, though measured and restrained, had positioned them as a critical node within the unfolding conflict. Authority had responded with increased aggression, Servants had revealed their alignments, and the cost of silence had become visible. The story had not yet reached its climax, but the conditions for it were fully established. The next step would not be incremental. It would be decisive, and its consequences would be irreversible. The confrontation did not arrive as a single dramatic event, but as a convergence of pressures that finally exceeded the system's ability to contain them. The plantation's internal order had been sustained through routine, fear, and fragmentation, but the concealed space beneath the master's bedroom had become a structural weakness rather than a protected secret. Each measure taken to hide it introduced new instability.
Surveillance bred anxiété.
Punishment bred suspicion. Silence bred rumor. By the time the final escalation began, the system was already straining under the weight of its own enforcement. Authority responded by consolidating control. The plantation owner initiated a comprehensive restriction of movement within the house, reducing the number of servants permitted indoors at any given time. Duties were compressed, forcing longer hours under closer observation. The overseer coordinated these changes, positioning himself as both enforcer and filter, controlling the flow of information upward while maintaining pressure downward. This reorganization was not framed as punishment but as necessity. It communicated that the household was under threat, though the nature of that threat remained unspoken. The servant was drawn back into proximity deliberately. The reassignment was no longer framed as routine. It was precise, timed, and unavoidable. The servant understood that this represented the system's attempt to resolve uncertainty by forcing exposure. Either the servant would demonstrate ignorance through compliant behavior, or awareness would surface through hesitation, error, or reaction. The system did not require confession. It required confirmation. Within the master's bedroom, the atmosphere had changed again. The reinforced section of floor was no longer subtly concealed. Its presence was now aggressively masked, covered by additional furniture, and layered with measures designed to deter access rather than disguise it. This shift signaled urgency. The servant recognized that concealment had given way to fortification. The plantation was no longer confident that ignorance could be maintained indefinitely. The critical moment unfolded during a period of heightened supervision, when multiple authority figures were present in adjacent spaces. The servant was assigned to perform maintenance that necessitated partial removal of furniture near the reinforced area. This task placed the servant directly over the concealed space under observation. The system had engineered a situation in which neutrality was impossible. Any deviation would be interpreted as intent. As the task progressed, the servant encountered resistance beneath the surface, stronger and more defined than before. The reinforced section was rigid, recently sealed, and intentionally isolated from the surrounding structure. The servant's awareness crystallized into full understanding. This was not a storage space, nor an architectural anomaly. It was a controlled environment, designed to be hidden and accessed selectively. Its existence contradicted the plantation's public image and internal narratives of discipline and order. At this point, the servant faced the moment the system had been building toward. Continued performance would signal complicity. Refusal or hesitation would confirm suspicion. The servant chose neither. Instead, the servant completed the task with visible precision while internally preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The servant understood that the system's need for resolution would override procedural restraint. Exposure was imminent, whether initiated by the servant or imposed by authority. The confrontation began indirectly. The overseer initiated a series of procedural challenges, interrupting tasks and demanding clarification on minor deviations. These actions were designed to provoke response rather than gather information. The servant responded with controlled compliance, maintaining composure while refusing to supply interpretation. This restraint intensified scrutiny rather than relieving it. The system interpreted calm as calculation. The plantation owner entered the process decisively. His intervention shifted the dynamic from investigation to enforcement. He ordered a restructuring of the house's internal operations, isolating servants and limiting communication entirely. The servant was placed under continuous observation, not confined but effectively immobilized by scrutiny. This marked the collapse of plausible deniability. The system had identified the servant as a risk, even without explicit evidence. The climax unfolded when the concealed space itself became the focus of direct action. Authority determined that continued concealment posed greater danger than controlled exposure. The plantation owner ordered access to the space under tightly managed conditions, intending to neutralize the threat by reasserting control over it. This decision represented a miscalculation. By transforming secrecy into action, the system exposed its own vulnerability. The opening of the concealed space was not public, but it was not invisible. Multiple individuals were required to facilitate access, each bound by silence but united by awareness. The servant was present, positioned deliberately to observe without participating. This placement forced recognition. The servant now possessed direct confirmation of the space's function and purpose, grounded in material reality rather than inference. What was revealed did not rely on superstition or abstraction. The space was structured for domination, secrecy, and ritualized control, integrated into the plantation's system of power rather than separate from it. Its design reflected intention, repetition, and institutional support. The servant understood that this was not the work of an individual acting in isolation, but of a system that permitted and protected such practices as long as they remained hidden. The exposure triggered immediate reaction. Authority figures moved to contain information, issuing orders designed to fragment observation and enforce silence. However, the damage was done. The act of opening the space had transformed rumor into fact. Even those who did not fully understand its purpose recognized its significance. The plantation's internal narrative of order had been irreversibly compromised. Betrayal emerged as a survival response. One individual, seeking protection, redirected suspicion toward another, offering partial information framed to minimize personal risk. This act did not clarify the truth but intensified chaos. Authority responded with punishment that was swift and disproportionate, reinforcing fear rather than restoring control. The servant observed this sequence with clarity. Exposure did not bring justice. It redistributed suffering. The servant was confronted directly with the consequences of awareness. Authority made clear that continued existence within the house required submission not only to labor but to silence. The servant faced the ultimate moral reckoning: to internalize the truth and survive as part of its concealment, or to resist and accept the certainty of retaliation. The system offered no compromise. Neutrality was no longer possible. The servant's final act in this phase was not rebellion in the conventional sense. It was an assertion of coherence. When pressured to submit to the system's narrative, the servant maintained internal consistency rather than compliance. This refusal to fragment understanding constituted a form of resistance that the system could not tolerate. Authority responded accordingly, imposing irreversible consequences designed to eliminate the servant as a source of instability. The climax concluded with visible outcomes that reshaped the plantation's internal order. The concealed space was sealed permanently, altered beyond recognition, or integrated into the structure in a way that erased its distinctiveness. Servants associated with the exposure were removed, reassigned, or silenced. New rules were imposed that further restricted movement and communication. Outwardly, the plantation returned to routine. Internally, it had been permanently altered. The The servant's fate was left unresolved at the end of this phase, suspended between survival and erasure. What was clear, however, was that the confrontation had not restored stability. It had merely reasserted power at a higher cost. The system had survived the challenge, but in doing so, it had exposed the depth of its dependence on secrecy and violence. The moral question at the heart of the story had reached its sharpest point. The truth had been revealed, but justice had not followed. By the close of this part, the plantation stood in a state of enforced order, its hierarchy intact but its legitimacy fractured. The servant's actions, though constrained, had forced the system to reveal itself. The consequences of that revelation would not be immediate or evenly distributed, but they would endure. The story moved now into its final phase, where aftermath, memory, and legacy would determine what remained of the truth once power had finished burying it. In the days that followed the confrontation, the plantation resumed its outward routines with deliberate speed. Fields were worked on schedule, deliveries continued, and the house maintained its appearance of controlled normalcy. This rapid return to order was not a sign of recovery but of containment. The system understood that disruption was most dangerous when allowed to linger. By restoring visible discipline, authority aimed to overwrite recent events before they could solidify into shared understanding. To an external observer, the plantation appeared unchanged. Internally, however, the structure had shifted in ways that could not be reversed. The concealed space beneath the master's bedroom no longer existed in any form recognizable to those who had seen it. It was sealed, altered, or dismantled with urgency, its physical traces removed or absorbed into the architecture. The effort invested in this erasure confirmed its significance. The plantation owner ensured that no material evidence remained that could be independently examined. What could not be destroyed was recontextualized. The space was transformed from a secret into an absence, something that could not be referenced because it no longer had a physical location. This act of removal did not eliminate the truth. It displaced it entirely onto memory. The servant's fate unfolded without ceremony. There was no public accusation, no formal resolution. The system did not acknowledge the servant as a source of disruption. It simply removed the variable. Whether through reassignment, confinement, or disappearance from the household, the servant ceased to occupy a visible role within the plantation's daily operations. This outcome was consistent with the system's logic. Individuals were not punished to correct behavior but to eliminate risk. The servant's knowledge, rather than any specific action, had rendered them incompatible with continued proximity to power. For those who remained, the consequences manifested as increased discipline and diminished trust. New protocols governed movement within the house, limiting access to private areas and enforcing stricter supervision. Servants were rotated frequently to prevent familiarity with any single space. Tasks were simplified, reducing opportunities for observation. These measures were not framed as responses to past events but as improvements in efficiency. The language of order masked the reality of fear. Everyone understood that the system had been challenged and had responded by tightening control. Silence became institutionalized. Servants avoided reference to the recent disruption not because they had forgotten it, but because memory itself had become dangerous. The absence of the servant who had been closest to the concealed space served as a constant reminder of consequence. No explanation was offered, and none was requested. In such environments, questions functioned as admissions. Survival depended on the ability to accept ambiguity without seeking resolution. Despite these efforts, the event could not be fully erased. It persisted in fragmented form, circulating through indirect references and altered behavior. Certain areas of the house were avoided instinctively. Certain tasks were performed with visible discomfort. New servants sensed boundaries without understanding their origin. The plantation's internal culture absorbed the shock and redistributed it as caution. What had occurred became less a story than a pattern of avoidance, embedded in routine. Among the enslaved community beyond the house, the effects were subtler but no less real. Changes in the household influenced labor distribution and oversight across the estate. Increased tension within the house translated into harsher enforcement elsewhere. Punishments became less predictable, reinforcing the perception that authority was unstable. This instability did not inspire resistance. It discouraged it. When power appears threatened, it often becomes more dangerous rather than less. The moral question at the center of the story emerged most clearly in this aftermath. The servant's awareness had not produced justice. The exposure of the concealed space had not resulted in accountability. Instead, it had triggered a reassertion of control that redistributed harm downward. The system had survived by sacrificing individuals and absorbing truth into silence. This outcome challenged any assumption that revelation alone could disrupt entrenched power. Truth, when unsupported by structural change, became another liability for the vulnerable. Yet the event was not without impact. The plantation's authority, while outwardly intact, now relied more heavily on force and surveillance than before. Its legitimacy had been weakened internally, even if it remained unchallenged externally. Those who enforced discipline did so with greater urgency, aware that concealment required constant effort. Power had been forced to acknowledge its dependence on secrecy, and that acknowledgement altered its behavior. Control became more brittle, less confident, and more reactive. The servant's experience entered oral memory in distorted forms. It was never spoken of directly, but fragments circulated as warnings rather than narratives. Younger servants learned which spaces were dangerous without knowing why. Certain actions were discouraged without explanation. The servant's absence became a reference point, a silent marker of what happened to those who saw too much. In this way, the truth survived not as information but as behavior. The system could erase evidence, but it could not fully erase the consequences of exposure. The plantation owner continued his operations, but his relationship to the house changed. His movements became more guarded, his control more explicit. The private spaces he once inhabited with confidence now required reinforcement and verification. The concealed space's removal had not restored ease. It had eliminated convenience at the cost of increased vigilance. Power now had to work harder to remain unchallenged. This was not justice, but it was consequence. For the broader historical context, the event remained undocumented. No records acknowledged the servant's discovery or removal. Ledgers continued uninterrupted. Visitors saw only discipline and productivity. The plantation's official narrative remained intact. This absence of documentation was not accidental. Systems of oppression are preserved not only through violence but through selective memory. What is not recorded cannot be challenged in official terms. The servant's experience existed outside the archive, confined to lived memory. The final reflection rests on this tension between truth and consequence. The servant had faced a moral dilemma with no acceptable resolution. Silence ensured temporary survival but enabled continued harm. Exposure revealed injustice but intensified repression. The story does not resolve this dilemma. It documents it. Within systems designed to suppress accountability, individual acts of awareness carry disproportionate risk. Truth, when isolated, becomes another instrument of control rather than a force for change. For a modern audience, the significance of the story lies not in its outcome but in its structure. It illustrates how power adapts to threat, how secrecy functions as infrastructure, and how moral courage can exist without producing redemption. The servant did not become a hero in the conventional sense. There was no liberation, no reversal of hierarchy. What occurred instead was a brief rupture in the system's narrative, followed by a recalibration designed to prevent repetition. The legacy of the event persisted in altered behavior, unspoken rules, and inherited caution. It became part of the plantation's internal history, shaping actions without ever being acknowledged. This form of legacy is common in oppressive systems. It allows power to absorb challenges without conceding authority. Memory survives, but only as warning, not as testimony. The story ends not with resolution, but with a question that extends beyond the plantation itself. When truth emerges within a system built to suppress it, who bears the cost of exposure? Is revealing hidden evil an act of justice if it results only in deeper silence and greater control? Or does the act of seeing, even without visible change, carry its own moral weight? The servant's experience does not answer these questions. It leaves them suspended, unresolved, as they were lived. In this unresolved state, the story achieves its historical resonance. It reflects not a singular atrocity, but a pattern repeated wherever power depends on secrecy. The plantation survived. The system endured. But it did so altered, marked by the knowledge that its authority had been seen, even briefly, for what it required. That knowledge, though buried, did not disappear. It remained embedded in memory, behavior, and fear, shaping lives long after the physical space that contained it had been erased.